I know it's hard to tell from this angle, but this is not a 3 Series GT. Today on thetruthaboutcars.com, we're taking a look at the 2015 BMW X4. The best way to think of the X4 is as a styling exercise on the BMW X3. The X4 actually shares the hood and the headlamps, the suspension, and the ride height of the X3. We also have the dashboard, and many of the interior parts are also directly shared from that crossover. Of course, BMW doesn't want to call the X4 a crossover, they want to call it a sport activity coupe, even though it is a four-door vehicle. Up front, there are three different looks. The one you're taking a look at right here is the M-Line trim. Even though we have the 2-liter turbocharged engine under the hood, they're still referring to this as the M-Line. It's the latest in trends in the automotive industry to give you sporty trims on even the base engines. In addition to that modified front grille, we also get upgraded wheels and tires. These are 245 45 R19s. They're really wide and they're really grippy. Let's decipher the xDrive28i nomenclature on our particular model. xDrive refers to the fact that all models come standard with all-wheel drive. S-Drive is now what BMW is calling the rear-wheel drive trims. xDrive is the all-wheel drive trims. The 28i portion is what confuses a lot of people, especially if you're an older BMW owner. It no longer refers to engine displacement size, sort of relative engine position in their lineup, because this 28i model uses a 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder engine. It produces 240 horsepower, but if that's not enough, BMW does have their sweet 3-liter inline-6 engine producing over 300 horsepower, we all know, but BMW says it's 300, so we'll go with that. Putting power to the ground is ZF's 8-speed automatic transmission, and you'll notice by the position of this engine that the automatic transmission is way behind the front axle. You'll actually notice this engine is almost entirely behind the front axle as it is. Front axle is right about here. You can see the position of the front strut towers right there. They angle forward just a little bit, so the wheels are right about here in the vehicle. That means almost all of this engine is right back there behind the axle. It's excellent for weight balance. I mentioned the engine position because I suppose you could compare this 2-liter turbocharged version of the X4 with the Volvo V60 Cross Country, and maybe even the Mercedes-Benz GLA 250. Now, those two vehicles are front-wheel drive based platforms. That means the engine is sitting across the front of the vehicle. Most of the engine is above the axle, some of it is in front of the axle, but none of it really is behind the front axle. So that shifts the weight in those vehicles towards the front, and it's definitely noticeable out on the road. Even the difference between this and the BMW 3-liter version of this same vehicle is noticeable out on the road. The 2-liter turbo version feels very light, very nimble up front. If you're shopping around on the dealer lots, this may look very similar to the BMW 3 Series GT, which seems like a very similar kind of vehicle, but it is a little bit different. And that's because the X4 shares this dashboard, steering wheel, etc. with the BMW X3. And it's really noticeable right here where the iDrive screen is placed in the dashboard. All of these parts are very similar to what you'll find in the 3 Series sedan, wagon, and the 3 Series GT. It's not exactly the same. Versus the BMW 3 Series, I think this feels a little bit more premium, which isn't too surprising because the X3 and the X4 have been refreshed more recently than 3 Series. Like the X3, front seat comfort is absolutely excellent. We get a multi-way power driver's seat with a 4-way adjustable lumbar support, adjustable bolstering, and we also have a manual adjustable thigh extender. You should know that the 4-way adjustable lumbar support that contributes highly to the comfort level of these seats is optional on the X3 and the X4. To make the X4 out of the X3, they did not lower the suspension on the vehicle. It has the same ride height as the X3, but they did lower the roofline. However, headroom in the rear does not take as much of a dive as you might think because they've actually lowered these seat bottom cushions closer to the ground. That means I have a lot less thigh support right here, although I do have sufficient legroom sitting right here behind myself. Now you'll notice in the BMW 3 Series GT that we have almost 4 inches more rear legroom. That has a huge back seat. Now if I sit upright, you'll notice that the X4 still has a decent amount of headroom that makes the rear seat an awful lot more comfortable than you might expect. If I move over to the middle seat, I don't have a whole lot of room to put my feet around here, but I still have enough headroom that my hair is just barely brushing the ceiling. My head isn't really banging on anything. As you might expect, cargo room takes a big hit because of the sexy side profile. We get about 1/3 less cargo room back here than you'll find in the X3 or in your average compact crossover in this luxury segment. Now, interestingly enough, we have about the same kind of room back here as you'll find in a Porsche Macan, which I would say is probably direct competition in base form with the top-end 3-liter turbocharged version of the X4. All X4 models in the US are all-wheel drive, but this all-wheel drive system is tuned to favor the rear wheels in terms of power bias. So normally most of the power is going out there to the back wheels. It's only going to send power to the front when it needs to, when it either thinks that wheels are going to slip, when you floor the vehicle, when you're going around a corner and it wants some extra grip, etc. This X4 doesn't have the fancy torque vectoring system that we get in the BMW X6, but it does have a brake-based torque vectoring system, which does make it feel a little bit more responsive out on the road. The operation of this system is noticeable out on the road, and it's really the only difference between this and the X3. Because the X4 shares the same suspension as the X3, the same ride height, and it only weighs 20 pounds less, it behaves very, very much like that X3 out on the road. That's not a bad thing because the X5 and the X3 feel much more nimble, much more connected to the driver, and much lighter out on the road than something like a Q5 or a Volvo XC60. As with anything with electric power steering, there's not as much feel as I would like behind the wheel, but the steering weight is just about perfect. The steering action is also a little bit quicker than some of the competition. One thing you really should know about the M Sport variety that we're testing here is that the ride is very stiff. I really recommend getting the $1,000 adaptive suspension system because it does solve this problem. It has the ability to adjust the valve rate on the dampers, making the ride either firmer or more compliant depending on which option you checked with this drive mode selector. The tricky thing out on the road with the X4 is, of course, the comparisons, because there isn't really anything else out there like this other than BMW's own 3 Series GT. I keep grasping at straws, trying to find other competitors that aren't really similar to what we're looking at right here. The Porsche Macan comes to mind, of course, because it's about the same size inside and out, but there's no 2-liter turbocharged version of the Macan. So I suppose you could see this as the discount alternative to the Macan. The 3-liter turbocharged version of the X4, performance-wise, comes much closer to that base version of the Macan, but this one is a decent amount behind. Pricing for 2015 starts at $44,700. That does make the X4 more expensive than the X3. If you want the 3-liter turbocharged engine, you have to add about $4,000 to that price tag. As tested, the model we've been looking at is $54,500, but I think my price configured would be the $58,000 almost fully loaded 2-liter turbo version. I think I would buy the 2-liter turbo, but I would always be thinking about that 3-liter turbo. My practical side, I think, would win. Better fuel economy, slightly more nimble feeling handling. They handle just about as well as one another, really, but the 2-liter has a slightly better feel to it. I would definitely get the dynamic dampers because those really improve the ride out on the road. If you're just looking at base prices, the X4 does cost $4,300 more than the X3. But we do get the standard HID headlamps that our particular model has on it and the standard moonroof that you don't find in the base X3. That means that the true delta between the two is about $2,600. It is still a premium, and you do get a slightly less practical vehicle for that, but this is again a styling exercise, and generally you pay for style. Now you could certainly see this as a stylish step up from a Volvo V60 Cross Country. This is going to cost you about $9,000 more than that Volvo, but it does have a much nicer interior. It also handles considerably better, and we have options in this vehicle that you don't find in the Volvo, like the LED headlamps, heads-up display, finger writing recognition system, etc. We have about the same amount of cargo capacity in the V60 and in the X4 because both vehicles, in different ways, are prioritizing style over practicality. Obviously, the X3 is a close competitor. It will set you back $4,300 less in base form. We don't get those standard features that we got up front, which really sets the actual price differential to about $2,600 more. Generally have to pay more for style. That's definitely going on in the X4. The tricky comparison, of course, is the BMW 3 Series GT, which has this exact same profile going on the back. Now, they're not the same vehicle, so this is not a jacked up version of that 3 Series GT. They don't really share that many interior parts, they don't really share that many suspension parts or any other vehicle parts, etc. The 3 Series GT is actually about 5 inches longer than this, and most of that additional room goes right here to the back seat. We have about 4.5 inches more rear legroom. We also have reclining rear seat backs, and that 3 Series GT is actually less expensive than this model. The 3 Series GT comes with the same engines and the same transmissions, and interestingly enough, essentially the same all-wheel drive system as well. The difference in handling is a little bit interesting because they both handle very, very well, but the feel is better in the BMW 3 Series GT than this X4. The X4 is a little higher off the ground, we get a little bit more body roll, a little bit more pitch and dive when you're driving out on the road. The 3 Series GT, on the other hand, feels a little bit more nimble, a little bit more connected to the driver, and definitely a little bit lighter than this X4. Now, the trickiest comparison is the Porsche Macan, but I don't really compare it to this particular model. I'd only compare it to the X4 with a 3-liter turbocharged engine. The base version of the Macan gives you 340 horsepower and a 7-speed dual-clutch transmission. The 3-liter version of the X4 gives you 300 horsepower and an 8-speed automatic transmission. The price difference is actually smaller than I expected it to be. It comes between $1,800 and $5,000 depending on how you configure the model. Obviously, there's a difference in the handling abilities of the vehicle, but again, it's not as big as I thought it would be. I've only had a relatively short amount of time to spend in the Porsche Macan, and it does handle incredibly well, don't get me wrong. I'm just talking about the difference between the two. Interestingly enough, the cargo capacity in the Macan is right about the same as the X4, even though we don't have the same kind of shape going on in the back. The Macan is a little bit more traditional crossover shaped, but it doesn't actually translate to any more cargo capacity. The difference between the two is less than 1 cubic foot. With a cargo capacity difference that's that small, the X4 is definitely the value alternative to the Macan. I actually think it looks a little bit better too. I really like the way that this shape looks in the side profile. I don't think it's very practical, but I do like the way that it looks. I also like the fact that the X4 seems a little bit more restrained, and the Macan is just a little bit more outrageous. It's a little bit more boy racer, definitely is more sporty looking, more aggressive looking, but I think I like the look of the X4 just a little bit better. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes, and this has been the 2015 BMW X4. Find us over at thetruthaboutcars.com for the full written review, news, reviews, and more. You can also find us over at Twitter and at Facebook. I'll see you next week.